I'd just like to remind you all, if you haven't filled in one of our forms to get our email, be on our email mailing list, just fill in these 2 sheets of paper here. Make sure you print it legibly so we can get it accurately onto our computer. And without any further ado, I'll introduce Tom here, and he can launch into the wild blue yonder.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hello. How you doing tonight? Good. Me too. Glad to be on this side of the grass. I want to start with a little story. It's dated because it involves an aircraft called the I can't remember. No, it's a Boeing 300, and 727, yeah. Jeez. Anyway, these 2 guys are going from Rapid City to Hollywood. You know, they've never been on an airplane before, and so they're up there a little nervous and everything, you know, and they're about halfway. And the pilot calls up and says, ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. He says, we, unfortunately because of fuel starvation, we've lost the #1 engine. Please don't be alarmed, the aircraft can fly just fine on his 2 remaining engines. And, but we're going to be about 20 minutes late getting into LA. And one guy says to the other, oh, okay. Anyway, about another half an hour, the captain calls again and said, ladies and gentlemen, because of an oil problem, we've lost another engine, the #2 engine. And so we'll be about 45 minutes getting into LA. And then one guy says to the other, says, you lose that last engine, we're going to be up here forever. That's an old briefing team joke. Anyway, I entered the Air Force as an enlisted man back in '63 and went through basic training. I was an aviation cadet candidate as a pilot. But while I was in basic, they shut down the pilot aviation cadet program. And I went, you got to be kidding me. I could have been a navigator, but I didn't want to be one. No comment on navigators. I flew with a lot of them, but no, I wanted to be a pilot. But long story short, I ended up getting sent to USC on a full scholarship from the Air Force under the Airman Education and Commissioning Program. Are you familiar with that? It's where they take enlisted men that have at least 2 years of college and a good GPA and all this stuff, and they send them back to college to get a degree in a specialty where the Air Force is having difficulty hiring candidates to be officers. And they needed motion picture directors, so that's what I got my degree in, cinematography. And I went up to Hollywood for a year and worked at an Air Force studio in the Hollywood Hills, making recruiting films and documentaries and all that kind of stuff, with Ava Gardner and Frank Sinatra and Jack Jones and people like that. So anyway, then I was stationed out here in March in '67 as a 2nd lieutenant commanding a combat photographic detachment. And I went to EY quite a bit, supporting 15th Air Force. But anyway, that's when I applied for pilot training and got my wings in March of '69. Pretty much the rest is history. I got involved in the C-17 program after having been assigned to an aircraft program called the Advanced Medium STOL Transport. I'm going to talk about that here in just a minute. I was the only one left that actually had worked on that program after it was canceled, and the CX came along, which became the C-17. I was on the AMST program because I was the only one that had done assault landings, airdrop, and in-flight refueling, which I did on the C-5. So I brought a little bit of extra expertise to the program. Mine. Okay, this is what we're going to talk about tonight. In the late 60s, they did a lot of studies about tactical airlift, and one of the reasons was because, does everybody know the difference between tactical airlift and strategic airlift?
No.
Strategic airlift is when you're going to go from like here to Frankfurt and offload cargo and then transfer it to something that can go into a more austere base. Usually, often one without a developed runway, you know, like a dirt runway. That's called tactical airlift, and the only tactical airlifter we had at the time was the C-130 Hercules. Although it was flown extensively in Southeast Asia, and because of the terrain and a lot of other things, the wings were wearing out big time. So it was going to have to be replaced by something. And all the studies said that we needed a jet aircraft to be a tactical airlifter, and it would have to have all these different features, and it was going to have to be pretty unique. So, go ahead. That program at that time, because all tactical airlift, including all the C-130s, were assigned to Tactical Air Command at Langley. But after some of these studies were done, the decision was made to move all airlift to the same place, which was Scott Air Force Base, Illinois, under the Military Airlift Command. And that's how I ended up being on that program. One of the problems was that operational costs were really increasing, and the biggest reason, as it turns out, was the cost of air crews. You know, they weren't getting paid that much, never did they? But the cost of air crews was driving the cost of a new tactical airlift. So we were going to have a smaller crew, and we had another problem, and that was that demographically, we didn't have as many men available to be pilots. So we were going to have put women in the cockpit. Now, that's fine, except from what I was involved in, which was design of the flight deck and workload studies and all that kind of stuff. From an ergonomic standpoint, it was a real challenge. Not that it was difficult, but it just took a lot of time. Women have a shorter reach. Strength wasn't really a problem for the stuff that had to be done in the cockpit. It was maybe for a loadmaster, but not for a pilot. So we had to do a lot of studies on ergonomics to solve the problem, or what became a problem, of having female crews. And I covered that in that last bullet there. The other reasons that we needed more tactical airlift was because we didn't have as much pre-positioned equipment over in Europe because it had gotten expensive. And actually the flavor of some of the stuff we needed to keep over there had changed. And we needed to get vital equipment up to the front lines. And you had to do that with a tactical airlifter. And again, if the 130 wasn't available, then we had to have something else. Okay. The studies that we did on the advanced medium STOL transports ended up with these results. One of the biggest challenges was steep approaches in order to reduce the landing roll when you come into an undeveloped runway. And on the prototype program for the AMST, we actually flew 8 and 9 degree approaches, just, you know, to collect data. But anyway, the other thing was that it had to be able to carry an M1A1 tank, and which is called outsized cargo, and must provide some cost savings, which was going to be tough. There were so many issues involved in trying to build a tactical airlifter that was a jet that there were a lot of risks. So the program was designed so that it would have a risk reduction program, and that was to let a contract for 2 prototypes to one contractor that was current state-of-the-art, and another contract to another contractor for forward-looking state-of-the-art. And again, this all happened at Tactical Air Command, and then they transferred it to MAC. Okay, so 2 contracts were awarded, one to Boeing, which built the 2 prototypes, and they were like advanced state-of-the-art, you know, fly-by-wire flight control system, multifunction displays in the cockpit, and the current state-of-the-art design was awarded to McDonnell Douglas, and they were going to build an airplane that would use existing technology. And the idea between the two was to be able to pick which one was the most cost-effective and actually got the job done. And that kind of the Boeing aircraft used existing engines, production engines, which was CF6-50s. That's one of the first commercially available jumbo engines, which still flies today, by the way. I think there's a picture of it next. There we go. That's the YC-14 prototype, number 2. Number 1 didn't have camouflage. The 2 CF6-50 engines are sitting high on the wing like that because the technique they used to increase the lift and reduce the landing roll and allow it to fly these high, steep approaches was called the Coanda effect. And what that was that Dr. Coanda discovered that if you blow air over a surface, it tends to adhere to that surface. And that's basically the flaps that are behind those 2 engines modulated extremely fast with the amount of thrust coming out of the engine, and allowed the airplane to divert the exhaust down to the ground and give it more lift. A really radical concept. The Soviets actually copied it and built 21 aircraft that used that technique. Next slide. Okay, the guys at McDonnell Douglas used the current state-of-the-art, including things like a DC-10 flap handle and, as you see down there at the bottom, different engines. They used a JT-8D engine, which really wasn't big enough for the mission. And that was one of the problems with that program, was that we couldn't find an engine that that really would fit the bill and yet allow us to afford it. I think there's a photo of that one too. There we go. That's the YC-15, and there were 2 of them. This is prototype number 1, which number 2 was camouflaged. And next slide. These are the things we accomplished on that program. I spent a lot of time at the Flight Dynamics Lab at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base with a bunch of scientists looking at crew workload and cockpit design and all the issues that we were concerned about in flying a tactical airlifter with 2 pilots and 1 loadmaster. And it was daunting, to say the least. Next slide. One of the major things that we had to look at was we were going to go all over the world to these undeveloped or short runways, and we had to do a survey of what's available and what the airplane. Basically, what we were doing was saying, how good does it have to be, and you know, how often are we going to go some of these places, that sort of thing. And it was really an exhaustive survey. We looked at California bearing ratio, which you see in the last bullet there is how much an aircraft wheel or whatever would penetrate a surface. And the other one is called load classification number, which is, you know, how much weight can a particular runway or ramp hold before it begins to deteriorate. They're actually two different things. Next slide. Our research showed that we really had, in order to make these steep approaches, we really need some kind of an assistance, an asset to assist us in determining the angle to come in on an approach. And so it turned out that a heads-up display or some, even an austere one, which we used in the prototype program, really needed to be on the aircraft. And one is. The other problem that we had at the time, and this is of course more affecting the Boeing airplane, was that there was a program at the time called ETOPS, and what that, anybody knew what that is? It was the reason for the program was that they didn't think that an aircraft, if it had two engines, you know, if it lost one, then it could survive or make it to its destination. Which led, by the way, one of the major factors that led to the development of the TriStar, Lockheed TriStar, and the DC-10. Those airplanes essentially almost went away when it turned out that jet engines got so reliable that you could fly an airplane with two of them all the way across the Atlantic. Next slide. Next slide. Well, President Carter didn't like this program. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that he was from Georgia and Lockheed was in Georgia. Lockheed made a lot of attempts to get it canceled, and they finally did. We were in the middle of source selection when it happened in December of '77. The actual formal termination didn't happen until '79, and in the meantime, we put a team together to try to apply lessons learned from the AMST to the new program called the CX. Next slide. It's pretty much self-explanatory that the CX program would take as much risk reduction data as possible from the AMST program and apply it. Next slide. It had to be able to carry an M1A1 tank, which it can do. Of course, that's an M1A3 now. Air refueling capable. And the idea was that you'd go to the Fort Bragg, for example, and pick up the 82nd Airborne, in-flight refuel after you pick them up, and you can fly direct to the oil fields in Iraq or Iran or wherever, and drop them. So the aircraft also had to have provisions for food and restrooms and all that kind of stuff for the troops. Which, by the way, the C-5 already has, but it's for a different mission. One of the problems that we were worried about was degrading the runways after making a lot of passes. Particularly a problem with the McDonnell Douglas airplane because it used, as does the C-17, externally blown flaps where the engine exhaust is diverted down to give it additional lift. And that degraded the surface of certain runways. So that was something we had to look at. This is an artist's conception. This is actually an illustration that was from the McDonnell Douglas proposal. One of the things I want to point out here is the winglets that are on the airplane. The original wingspan of the airplane was too wide so you could put 3 aircraft on one ramp like this. The wingspan was too long. And so they came up with the idea of using winglets, which solved the lift problem, and cut down the wingspan so that we could put 3 airplanes on a ramp like that. I'm having trouble seeing this now, but we actually put together scenarios that we used on mock-ups of the flight deck to see if the flight crew could actually perform all these different missions. There were scenarios that we ran during the source selection to see if, the particular configuration that they proposed, Boeing, the two people that, actually 3 people proposed, Boeing, Lockheed, and McDonnell Douglas. Lockheed was eliminated in the first 6 weeks. Boeing was eliminated about 2 weeks later because they proposed the 3-holder airplane. And it was just phenomenal, when I talked to them and said, a 3-holder airplane, yeah, they were all excited about it. What are you going to do when you got an airlift drop? What are you going to do with that center engine? And they went, I mean, it was just amazing that they totally had overlooked that. And then they came back and they said, we can pull the center engine to idle. I said, let me tell you something. I don't know any guy that's going to be in combat, and pull an engine to idle. I don't care who he is. So Boeing was eliminated. That's yours truly in the cockpit of the #1 prototype of the YC-15, obviously a long time ago. If you look in front of me, you'll see that there is a control stick that I'm flying the airplane with. And what we did, we took the yoke and we just chopped it off, and then we had some engineers put a few pulleys in, and it ended up flying the airplane with a left-handed stick. And we did that so we could collect data on particularly on the maneuverability of the airplane. But one of the things that we found out that we really liked, and that is that, without having that big yoke there, it really cut down the blocking of the instruments on the instrument ramp. So having a stick instead of a yoke really gave us a lot of visibility, more visibility in the cockpit. I think I was a captain then. Next slide. This was the commander of 22nd Air Force, General Gong. He flew with me. Gutsy guy, on that. And if you look at that airplane, you'll see that the engine in the #1 position is bigger than the other 3. And that's because it's a CFM56 engine, which was one of the candidates that they were trying to look at in order to meet the propulsion requirements for the airplane. If they would have put 4 of those on, they couldn't have afforded the program, and neither could we. But they put it there and did a lot of evaluation to see just what it might do. Yes, sir?
Where's this picture at? Where is this at?
Oh, that's at Scott Air Force Base, Illinois?
So Scott.
Yeah. Next slide. One of the problems we had in trying to keep the program alive and be honest about everything we were doing was dealing with Lockheed and all their efforts to get the requirements changed that would favor a C-130 or a C-5 more. That was tough. But also, one of the things that we insisted on, particularly after what happened with the C-5, basically the engine on the C-5 the TF-34 was, TF-39, excuse me, was the first military version of the CF-6-50. In fact, it was the first jumbo engine of any engine, even before the JT9D from Pratt & Whitney. And we had to grow up with that engine on the airplane, and really, you know, all the learning curve stuff and all the problems that might occur with maintenance or anything else, we had to eat it on the program, and we just said, we're not going to do that again. So the requirement, we came up with this requirement that said, whatever engine we put on the C-17 is going to be a commercial engine, and it's got to have 2 million hours of flying time in the commercial fleet before we put it on a C-17. And that's what we did. And by the way, the engines on the airplane are just marvelous. They really are. Okay. This kind of talks to what I was mentioning about Lockheed and our defense against, you know, them trying to get the requirements that would favor a C5 or their derivative or whatever more. And we were
C-17 come back up.
say,
C-17 come back up.
oh yeah. Well, the other thing is, those of us that were on the source selection team and that were running the program, we were tasked to report to the SPO director hourly on what Lockheed was doing. And that's that last floor. Kind of talks about source selection, and Lockheed submitted 2 designs. One was like a enlarged 141, and the other one was a derivative of the C5. But it was the C5 derivative was going to be too expensive, no question about it. I've got 3,200 hours in a C5, by the way. I know how expensive that airplane can be to fly. I also have about 1,800 in the 141. In fact, I've got 60 hours in that airplane sitting right outside. Before they stretched it and made it a B model. I flew it as an A model down in Georgia. Next slide. Well, this is a kind of an embarrassing slide in some respects. We awarded the contract in '81, but we didn't fly the first prototype until '91. And a lot of that was because of problems that McDonnell Douglas ran into. Actually, one of them was the fact that the Airbus ran into as well. We had subcontractors that were measuring, some measuring in metric and some of them measuring in English. And the parts didn't fit. I mean, the fact that, you know, supposedly first class contractors would do something like that, it just boggles our mind. But this kind of gives you the, you know, the fact that we started out with quite a few airplanes and then it got eaten away for different reasons. The total order was reduced to 120 aircraft by Vice President Cheney when he was the Secretary of Defense. And I'm sure it was just a financial thing, but anyway. While we were in source selection, we were directed by the Air Force to evaluate a new proposal that came in for 50 C-5Bs, which was an upgraded version of the C-5 itself. So we were supposed to stop source selection and evaluate that proposal, which we did. We didn't stop source selection, but we worked, you know, shifts and all that kind of stuff to do what we were supposed to do. Next slide. By the way, McDonnell Douglas did a tremendous job on this airplane. They really did. And in many cases went above and beyond what their requirements were. And the people there, I was there all the time. virtually, and the people there were just incredible to work with. I really enjoyed it very much. Okay, next slide. That's what the airplane was originally supposed to do after the delivery of the 71st aircraft. They changed the configuration of the aircraft and put fuel in the center wing, which they had not done before. So it gave it more range. And they changed the designation to extended range. And allowed it to only go to 28,000 feet. 450 knots cruise speed, 0.76 Mach, that's what the 141 outside does, 0.77. So, 102 paratroops, and they're being dropped as we speak, particularly up in Alaska. There's a lot of paratroop drops up there. Next slide. The C-17 has what's called a high bypass ratio engine on it. And high bypass ratio means it's the ratio of the fan exhaust and the amount of thrust that it provides in relationship to the core jet engine, okay? In the case of the C-17, it's 5.9, that's the ratio. On the C-7, it's 7.88. C-5. It's 7.88, really high bypass ratio. And that comes into play when you're designing the systems to be able to reverse thrust on the airplane. You can't use clamshells, you know, like they used on all the other aircraft. You have to use a system that uses what's called fixed cascades and blocker plates. And the cowl itself actually becomes what's called a translating cowl. It shifts backward when you go into reverse thrust, and blocker plates are exposed to block the thrust from going behind the engine and direct it back through these fixed cascades. You're going to see a little eye candy later on that'll show you that. Next slide. Well, we delivered 200 airplanes, and then we did some FMS aircraft. I think there were about 30 of those. The last one was, I think, was to Qatar. In fact, I was down there when that aircraft took off from Long Beach. And everybody from the program was out there watching it, crying and all that stuff. Okay, trying to keep the production line open, and they did for a while, but anyway, next slide. Okay, eye candy. Okay, well, the first one I'm going to show is an assault landing by a C-17 at Altus Air Force Base, which is a training base. And I'll point out a couple of things that are going on. That's the announcer at Commercial Altus Air Force Base in Oklahoma. And that's going to be providing some of the features of the airplane. Now, when they reverse the engines, you're going to see the cowling go backward, and it'll expose the fixed cascades after the water replaces the water. The thrust from going up to the backside of the engine, directed back to the fixed cascades.
Very little flare.
This landing, they stopped it at 1,400 feet.
What's approach speed?
Probably about 95 knots.
All right. Touchdown. Pilot, come up off the way. See the engine slide back.
You can see the transiting column going half of the cascades.
About 1,400 feet.
That's pretty fast. Well, I didn't cover it, but there's a requirement that the airplane has to be able to back up a 3-degree grade at full growth rate. Maximum growth rate.
They are based here, they are taught here, and they are the best here. The C-17 crews from all the Air Force bases.
This is what the pilot presentation looks like in the C-17. It's the same as both seats. Start it over again. See over there. Everything the pilot needs in order to fly an approach or even fly a loop is on the HUD. This course, heading, altitude, rate of climb, it's all there. I don't know who that gal is in the back. If you look closely or look at it more than once, you can see what I was talking about having the stick really gives you a lot more visibility of the instrument panel, even though you've got a HUD as well. One of the things we learned when we did the testing in the YC-15 with the jury-ridden stick was, and one of the reasons why it's so important, is because after you've delivered your cargo, first of all, since the aircraft is in-flight refuelable, you don't need to have a lot of fuel on the airplane when you land. Okay, so you get rid of your cargo and you take off, and you have a relatively light airplane in comparison to other aircraft. And you can actually pull 5 Gs in a spiraling turn as you climb out, which reduces the amount of exposure to ground fire. Then you get up to altitude, then you go get your gas. So that was one of the big reasons for the stick, is to give it more maneuverability. By the way, it can fly formation with an F-16. Big time.
Who provided all the multiplayer function displays?
Different subcontractors. Sperry was one.
Colin?
Ziggett Collins was another. Most of the radios are Collins. And I spent a little time in Rapid City. I mean, not Rapid City again.
Cedar Rapids?
Cedar Rapids, yeah. If you have any questions about anything I covered?
Not about what you covered, but I've noticed that there's a few extra friends, some C-17s on the ramp parked with the 135s. Who are they?
It's for you extra what?
There are some extra C-17s parked on our ramp today, mixed in with our 135s.
Well, March.
Here on our ramp.
Yeah.
Well,
they're
are they ours or a visiting squadron?
there's 7 aircraft assigned to March.
Yeah, I saw 7.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and occasionally they'll be augmented by other aircraft. One thing that's unique about March, even though it's a reserve base, the Air Force Reserve can task these aircraft directly. They don't have to go through Headquarters Air Force or Headquarters Air Force Reserve or anything else. If Military Airlift Command Headquarters has a requirement for this airplane, they can call up the wing commander and task him at this base. It's the only one like that. And which I think is a real compliment to the crews and the management and all that. The 135s are part, as I understand it, are part of an active duty squadron. They aren't reserved. Right?
I thought they were reserved.
No, they're actually part of an active duty squadron. Well, I know it was a little sloppy, but anyway, at least you understand how the airplane came about. I loved working on it. I've never flown it. I've flown the simulator, which was a thrill. Yes, sir.
The YC-14s and 15s, I think I've seen one of them at Edwards and one down at Pima Air Museum.
Yeah, actually, there were two at Pima.
Was it?
I don't know what happened with the other one.
There used to be one at the gate at Edwards.
Yeah, there's a YC-15 there.
Yeah.
Because I was there when they put that airplane in there after they put it all back together, after they shipped it from Long Beach. And in fact, they gave me a plaque when they set that airplane up, which was really neat. Because I was the only guy left that had flown it. So, yeah, it was a real thrill, being involved in these airplanes, getting to fly them, that kind of thing. But it was really a breach birth when it came to trying to get this airplane built and keep it from getting canceled. And,
Well, how slow could you get a YC-14 or 15?
oh, well, the 14 you could get probably down to about 55, 60 knots.
It's still flying,
Oh yeah.
really?
Well, I had all that thrust out there from the CF6s.
CF6, yeah.
And the 15 was a little bit more of a problem because it relied on those trailing edge flaps to give it more lift. And the C-17, if you look on the C-17, you'll see that there's that kind of concept on their flaps. They actually extend more than they would on a normal airplane. Yes, sir.
You could land it in, what'd you say, 1,400 feet or something like that?
Yeah.
Under the same conditions, what would it take to get it back off the ground?
Maybe 1,000 feet.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And in the 15, we actually landed it in about 900 feet, backed it up and took off in 600.
Cessna 150 won't do that.
No, I mean, it's because of the amount of lift that you end up getting, at lower speed. It's just amazing. So, yeah, people used to make money. They bet somebody at the bar that, that somebody was paying up. Well, I wish I would have been a little bit better presenter, but my physical problems kind of got in the way here, and I apologize.
Thank you very much.
You did fine. Thank you.
We're just so lucky to have this airplane. I really mean it.